Well, we're happy you guys are here today. It's a really cold morning and glad you braved this re-entry of winter into our lives. But we want to welcome you to the 39th Annual Nashville Conference on African American History and Culture. I'm Tim Walker, the Executive Director of the Metro Historical Commission, and it's been a great honor for our commission to co-sponsor this event through its 39 years with TSU. And 39 years, what a long time. I think the only member here that I see who's been here since the beginning is Miss Wynn, and I'm not sure if she ever thought the conference would still be going on in 2020, but here we are, and next year is a really milestone year. So this conference has really been a great success over the 39 years. It went from what was a conference that took place in a single classroom with a few dozen people to today where we have over 300 people registered, which is pretty fabulous. And you'll notice you got 4 new profiles this year. This really adds to the accomplishments of the conference. We now have over 130 profiles that have been written or presented at the conference. And over the years, there have been more than 260 presentations and performances. It's really quite a success. Well, before we get started, I want to take a quick moment and I want to thank those who are responsible for making this day a success. And so I want to recognize the planning committee. I know a number of those members are here with us now. Some will be arriving later. And so if they would please stand as I call their name, and if you'd hold your applause until everybody's standing. So first, if I could recognize Dr. Revis Mitchell and Linda Wynn, and committee members Gloria Johnson, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts at TSU, Glenda Alvin, Pamela Bobo, Katie Ewing, Gloria McKissick, Jessica Reeves, Jamal Sheets, Sharon Hull Smith, and Lee Williams. Let's give them a round of applause, please. It couldn't happen without these people who work all year, especially Linda, who takes such a leadership role in it. I also want to take a moment to recognize our county historian, Dr. Carol Busey. Would she stand? And the Metro Historical Commission members who are here with us. Would you please stand? Thank you. And finally, I want to thank the TSU and Historical Commission staff who are working registration this morning. They're Christy Green, Scarlett Miles, Carolyn Eller, and Susie Pallas. I want to thank them. And before I hand the podium over to Ms. Wynn, you should have gotten a bag like this as your profiles and other information came in. It says Nashville Sites. I hope you'll take a minute to check it out. There's a rat card in there, and there's a one-pager that explains some of the African-American related tours that are part of Nashville Sites. That's a mobile-friendly website and app that was launched in November by our office with our foundation and many other institutions, including TSU. And, a note, and it's listed in there, Dr. Williams on the planning committee wrote 2 of the tours, and Ms. Wynn wrote 1, so you'll have to go and check those out. Well, finally, to finish this morning's welcome, I want to hand the podium over to Ms. Linda Wynn. Everyone who knows Linda knows she stays very busy. She wears a lot of hats, and besides being a co-founder of the conference, she's a noted writer and historian. She's a faculty member of the history department at Fisk University. She's the Assistant Director of State Programs at the Tennessee Historical Commission, and I'm proud to say, and I think this is 6th year, she's a member of the Metro Historical Commission. So, Ms. Wynn.
Thank you, Tim. Again, let me wish each and every one of you a happy Valentine's Day. And thank you for braving the cold and being here this morning. It is much colder than it was yesterday at this time. My sister called me this morning and asked me if I knew it was 21 degrees outside, and I told her no. She says, well, you probably need to dress appropriately, so I appreciated her calling me. I would like to thank the financial contributors without whom this conference would not be possible. The Kibalon Images has been with us for 39 years. Armagh, the Frieson Foundation has been with us for 39 years. Holy Trinity Episcopal Church, we have a new financial sponsor this year, the Metro Historical Commission Foundation. Jefferson Street Baptist Church, the Tennessee Historical Society, which has been with us for 39 years. Spruce Street Baptist Church, 39 years, and TSU Friends of the Library. Let's give them applause, because without them, this wouldn't be possible. I would also like to thank Dean Gloria Johnson, who will not be able to be here this morning, for her continued support of the conference. We have already mentioned Christy Green, but I want to mention her again, who is in Dean Johnson's office, because she takes care of all of the minute details for putting the conference together. I want to thank the staff of the Tennessee Historical Commission and its director, Patrick McIntyre. Will the staff of the commission please stand? It's always good to have support from your colleagues. Also would like to thank the history departments of Tennessee State University and Fisk University. Will you please stand? And we certainly want to thank the 2020 presenters who agreed to share their time and their research with you this morning and this afternoon. I also bring greetings from Dr. Revis Mitchell, the co-chair of the conference, who could not be here today, but he wanted me to tell you in his absence that this is the first year that he has ever missed a conference, and he thanks all of you who have thought about him over the last year, and he hopes to see you next year. Last but certainly not least, I would like to thank the history majors at Fisk University who are serving as ushers this morning, and they are Terry Blackburn, who is the only sociology major, Imani Campbell, Cassandra Hanna, Elijah Martin, Sierra Poole, Paul Springer, D'Angelo Stargell. They are serving as ushers. So if you need any assistance, they will be in the back, and they will be glad to assist you up or down the steps. And in my closing remarks for this part, I would like to mention, lest we forget, this is the sesquicentennial of the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution. It is the centennial of the Constitution's 19th Amendment. It is also the 60th anniversary of the Nashville sit-in movement, the bombing of Z. Alexander's home, the silent march in protest against white supremacists, the desegregation of Nashville lunch counters and other public accommodations. It is the founding of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, better known as SNCC. Also the Freedom Rides. Remember, Nashville activists played key roles in the 1963 March on Washington, the Birmingham Campaign. They were the frontline leaders of the Mississippi Freedom Summer of 1964, and they were in the struggle to gain voting rights in Selma. All of these events were at the apogee of the modern civil rights struggle for human rights. As the late historian and Fisk University alumnus John Hope Franklin said of them, they were probably the most courageous and the most selfless civil rights workers. Thank you. Hope you enjoy the conference.
Good morning. I'd like to welcome all of my neighbors, my friends, my colleagues to this 39th annual conference. We're happy that you are joining us on a journey from enslavement to liberation. We hope you enjoy your day. We hope you enjoy all of our lectures as well as lunch. Our first presenter is a former TSU student, Bridget Jones. Bridget graduated from the Department of History, Political Science, Geography, and Africana Studies. In the past, she has served as Director of American African Studies at the Bellmead Plantation. She is a native Memphian. Her focus is 20th century history, civil rights, and American chattel enslavement. Recently, she was nominated for 40 Under 40 at Tennessee State University. Her presentation today is Tennessee Slavery, Perspectives, Parallels, and Psychology in relation to the Bellmead Plantation. Ms. Bridget Jones.
Hey, y'all. What y'all learn about me through this presentation is that I'm very happily as Southern as I can possibly be. And so you will realize that here in just a moment. So let's get this all set up. For those of you who have never seen or been to the Bellmead Plantation, this is what that big, beautiful building looks like from the inside. And Bellmead is a very peculiar type of plantation because they didn't grow any cash crop. So there was no cotton, there was no tobacco, there was no sugar cane in Bellmead. They raised a horse farm. Not regular horses, the best race horses of the era. Premier, thoroughbred race horses. It's a big deal and it's big money. And due to the industry, Bellmead had a huge enslaved population. By 1860, the Harding and Jackson family owned 136 men, women, and children. That put them in the top 4.5% of slaveholders in the state of Tennessee by 1860. So this family was a big deal in Nashville in that point in time. So what my thing is I do this weird blend of forensics. Everybody know what forensics is? It's like the art of spoken word. And I blend that with historic fact. So this isn't a typical tour. I'm trying to put you in the mind of the people that were there, which is why I call it Perspectives, Parallels, and Psychology, because you gotta address all three when you address enslavement. So we're gonna use one person in particular, and her name is Susanna Carter. Now, Susanna Carter is at the top of the food chain at Bellmead. Susanna Carter is the head of domestic staff. So that means that, yes, she's a house slave, but she is also the head house slave. She's a big deal in her own right. But Miss Carter has a very intriguing backstory. You see, Susanna Carter has two conflicting backstories. And I'm gonna tell you both of them, and I'll let you figure out what you want to believe for yourself. Now, what I know to be a fact is that she came to Bellmead from the Carnton plantation. And for those of you who know about Carnton, you know that Carnton was the site for the Battle of Franklin during the Civil War. And you know that Carnton was a Confederate hospital during the war. So Carnton is a huge Confederate memorial site today. Now, recent research has shown that there's a strong possibility that Susanna Carter could have been born and raised at Carnton. This only intrigued me because I went and talked to Susanna Carter's descendants. And you see, free and biracial. You see, Susanna Carter's family and descendants believe that there's a possibility that her father was English and that her mother was Native American and Black. And they believe that because of this, their father left his three biracial children in Randall McGavin's care to go on a business trip, and he died. So Miss Carter's descendants believe that Randall McGavin illegally enslaved Susanna Carter and each of her siblings. Now today, I can't tell you which one of these stories is true. The only thing I know for a fact is that in 1849, at about 14 years old, Susanna Carter arrives at Belmead in the last will and testament of Mrs. McGavin. Her last will and testament reads, "To my infant granddaughter, Mary Selina Harding, I give and bequeath my servant girl Susanna. So should that child die before me, I then leave the girl Susanna to my daughter Elizabeth Harding, wife of William Giles." So by our standards and our terms today, that would mean that in 1849, at about 14 years old, Susanna Carter became a baby shower present. See, she's given to an infant, and she gets to spend the rest of her life at Belmead, referred to as the trusted house slave of William Giles Harding. Now, in this picture, you can see Susanna Carter standing behind Celine, that's that infant, she's all grown up now, and her husband, General Jackson. Now, in 1886, Miss Carter got a very rare opportunity because she was interviewed. She was given an opportunity to tell her side of the story. And in 1886, a man named Charles Dudley Warner visited Nashville, and he's traveling here with Harper's Weekly. And when he arrived, you can't come to Nashville in 1886 and not stop at the premier thoroughbred nursery in the nation, the one that used to own 136 people. So when he arrived, he spoke to General Jackson. And he asked General Jackson what was in that period, a very simple question. He said, "Sir, could you introduce me to a real Southern mammy?" Mammy is a very intriguing person and theory almost when we look at historic documents, because when most people think about mammy, especially most people my age, we dive head first into Aunt Jemima biscuits and cornbread. Now, my parents' age, they dive head first into Gone with the Wind. Hattie McDaniel, Happy, Docile Dog, and Love Master. It's funny because this card plays in both categories. But our goal is to try to figure out why. I'm going to give you some of the questions that she was asked in her interview, and we're going to break them down. The first thing that she was asked in this interview was, "Miss Carter, what did you do with the family silver during the Civil War? I was told that you hid the silver for them." And Miss Carter's response was, "Sir, ain't you from the North? Sir, I can't tell you that. You's a Yankee. And if there's another war, sir, you gonna come right on down here and get that silver." Now, I'm gonna be full transparent here. When I first read this interview, I was like, yo, she tripping. Because, I mean, honestly, the silver didn't even make my list of stuff I thought she should be caring about. But I had to take myself out of it, put myself into her shoes, and try to see this through her lens for a moment. So let's review her answer. You see, what she said was that, "Sir, I can't tell you because you're a Yankee. I can't tell you because you're from the North. And so if there's another war, you gonna come right on down here and get that silver because you're from the North. So if there's another war, if told me that by 1886, Susanna Carter still ain't trusting that new freedom that she had." But put yourself in her shoes for a moment. Think about it. If you've been a slave your entire life, if everybody that looks like you has been a slave their entire life, do you believe in freedom? As of 1831, technically, it's illegal for free Black people to reside in the state of Tennessee. William Giles Harding sat on the committee that enforced that law, because what you don't want is a population of enslaved Black people looking at a population of free Black people, then admiring and aspiring and hoping and dreaming toward those crazy notions and ideas. You know, wild stuff like freedom. You can show freedom. You were supposed to get out of Tennessee it's easy for us to sit in our collective memory today and just agree that slavery is wrong. We can easily understand that slavery only continued as long as it did through violence on one hand, and then the threat of violence on the other hand. See, you have to beat people into this type of submission. Be that beating a physical beating or the most important beating of all, the mental one. You see, the fact that she could say in a sentence that, yes, I understand there's violence associated with this institution, but turn around in the same sentence and negate that same fact by saying, well, it's cool though, because if they'll need child, we had snack time too. What does that actually say about her psychological state at this point? You see, if you were to argue this with a shrink, they'd probably tell you she had Stockholm Syndrome. See, Stockholm Syndrome is an unhealthy dependence upon a captor, but you typically only see it in kidnapped victims. Now, that's a parallel. Now, if you were to argue this with someone that had been to or worked in a prison, well, they may say that she was institutionalized. You see, that means that you ain't had freedom in so long, and once you got it, you didn't want it because you didn't know what to do with it anyway. And there's a parallel. You see, our goal here is to draw parallels between yesterday and today, so let's begin. If the prison system is the new slavery, like they say it is, and if you look at the prison system, and the interesting amount of people that just so happen to go to the prison and just so happen to look like me, the interesting stretches of time they get in comparison to their counterparts. The fact that about 19% of U.S. prisons operating in America are operating for a profit, and some of these prisons even sit on the same ground or on plantations, like the Angola Penitentiary in Louisiana. Well, I guess we might be on something, huh? But then there's one last question. People hate the last question. You see, interviews like Ms. Carter's, they soothe consciousness for years and allow people to say stuff like, well, they said they was happy. But I mean, honestly, in 1886, as she's sitting in the gorgeous dining room at the Bellevue Plantation, talking to this random white guy that popped up on the front porch on Tuesday, talking about, tell me the truth. In 1886, as she's sitting at the table with the man that used to own her, the one that still employs her, in 1886, is Susanna Carter, a black woman in the South, sitting in that dining room in the position to tell the truth. See, slave narratives become popular in the 20th century. Around 1929, a woman named Ophelia Egypt, representing Fisk University, she went out through the South and she did the first slave narrative project. And you see, those interviews are some of the most chilling depictions of what life under slavery was. You see, those interviews would hit you dead in your chest. Those interviews are powerful. But you see, those interviews were never widely circulated, but another set was. You see, in the 1930s, as a result of the New Deal, the Works Progress Administration was founded. Now, the Works Progress Administration was a predominantly white organization that kind of heard about what Fisk did and kind of did their own slave narrative project too, and they became known as the WPA slave narratives. And man, as well-intentioned as those narratives may have been, those narratives have a slightly different undertone to them. You see, the WPA narratives, you don't get all that heart-wrenching realness. You get pages upon pages of stuff like, well, you know, sir, I ain't never received a beating I don't think I deserved. That's a direct quote from a 1937 Nashville interview. So what you may see happening here then is that the answers to the questions are beginning to change, all based upon the color of the person that was asking all the questions. That's funny. W.E.B. Du Bois said that black people were a veil when they walked through America. Slaves had a phrase too. They said that I got one mind for the white folk to see, and I got another mind that I know is me. That's funny. Maya Angelou wrote a poem in the 1970s. Well, rewrote a poem. She said that black folks wear a mask when they walk through life. You know, we wear the mask, it grins and lies, it hides our cheeks, it shades our eyes. This day we pay the human dial, and today the same interesting phenomenon is known as code switching. You see, times don't change, terminology does. So code switching is this really interesting thing that black people feel the need to do, is when we have to shift and kind of fluctuate in between cultures and societies. You must, on cue, rather than make yourself more accessible, more acceptable, more articulate, more approachable, more palatable, because essentially enslaved people there. What I left out is that 11% of that number is mulatto. Half black and half white. Now, I can't tell you where the mulatto slaves came from that part of the record book here. What I have happened to learn in 28 years of life, though, is that mulatto people don't fall out of the sky. So we can imagine where they came from, but I don't like assumptions. As a historian, I operate in fact, and I love a good fact, but I couldn't get a fact here, so I had to get creative. I learned how to explore my options. So let's explore. Let's put ourselves into the shoes of every person involved in this situation, because there's a common misconception that slavery only affected black people. Oh no. Slavery played a very interesting psychological game on the minds of white people too. Because honestly, how must master's wife have felt about all this? How must it feel to have to come to work every day, or come into your house rather, and look into the face of your husband's indiscretion every single day? Okay, so now let's look at this from the perspective of the slave. How must it feel to come to work every day and have to bear the brunt of someone's anger and aggression and resentment for a situation that you did not ask for, nor can you control? You see, well, the white women in that period didn't have too many options either. You see, it wasn't like they could go to their husbands and say, you better leave her alone, that's not your place just yet. So when she had some very understandable anger and aggression and resentment, who's she gonna take it out on when she can't go to her husband? Okay, let's dig a little bit deeper. What happens when that slave pop up pregnant by master? Now, how does master's wife feel? Because think about it. I know it got to hurt. How must it feel to come into your house every single day and look into the face of your husband's indiscretion every single day? Well, the white women had two options here. The children are labeled free property no matter how you spend it. And you can do with your free property what you wish to do with your free property. That means you can rent it if you don't want to sell it. Because people that couldn't afford to buy a slave could rent a slave. Did you know that? Now, in that instance, though, if you don't want to look at them every day, you can sell them. You see, now 146 years. And that ain't even counting the Portuguese and the Spanish who was here and did it first.
Let's give Ms. Jones another round of applause. So how is the journey so far? Our next presenter, Angela Sutton, is a postdoctoral fellow at Vanderbilt, where she works with the Mellon Partners for Humanities Education. She is on the board of the Friends of Fort Negley and is the director of the Fort Negley Descendants Project, which is an oral history archive and collects the voices and stories of Black Nashvillians who descended from the builders and defenders of Fort Negley. Dr. Sutton's presentation is entitled Fort Negley in Atlantic Context, the UNESCO Route. Dr. Sutton is going to continue on with our journey from enslavement to liberation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Hi. Good morning. I would really like to say thank you so much for allowing me to come and share my research with you. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Vanderbilt University, a historian. I worked in the Maritime Museum before moving to Nashville, and then I came here to do research on the Atlantic slave trade. And my work with Fort Negley allows me to really merge my love of public history with my research focus. So I want to tell you today about quite possibly one of the most unique and amazing historical sites that I've ever had the privilege of setting foot on. Yeah, all right. Sorry, it's always the tech. All right. All right, here we go. So, as many of you are aware, in 2017, Fort Negley Park took center stage in the city's battle over gentrification when part of this public land was sold by a former mayor, who we're not naming, to developers at far below market value. This alarmed a wide range of people, right, obviously, from activists to politicians, scholars, teachers, concerned citizens, most of the people in this room. I prepared the form to nominate Fort Negley as a site of memory on the UNESCO slave route. This form was submitted by the Friends of Fort Negley as well as the Nashville NAACP. And in 2019, we finally learned that Fort Negley was one of just 4 sites in the United States to earn this designation. It means that the United Nations recognizes the vital importance that Fort Negley has towards a global shared understanding of slavery and its modern legacies. So I'm going to speak a little bit more about what that means. Before I do that, I wanted to show you this map of the Atlantic slave trade. And some of you have been to some of my other talks. I put this one up almost every time I speak. And I do so because I think it illustrates really well just the sheer volume and also the geographical scope of the Atlantic slave trade. I think often in the U.S. we become very U.S. focused and U.S. centric, and that is important because we have so much digging to do in our own nation. But this map shows us that we are not the only nation with this problem, right? This is a global issue. Every other nation in the Americas has been touched by the stain of slavery in some way, and they're all dealing with these same issues just like we are. So I just want you to take a moment to look at this map and kind of absorb the sheer magnitude of what the Atlantic system of the slave trade looked like. All right, so I'd like you to focus on how entwined the world became through the slave trade to show that the U.S. is not unique. Every nation that had enslavement is now struggling with those legacies, so that means that they all face anti-Black bias, they all face mass injustice, economic and health disparities, fewer opportunities for mobility. So it makes sense that UNESCO tackles this on a global level with something like the slave route. Every nation which touched the slave trade was tainted by it. So I'm going to take you through a brief history of the site of Fort Negley specifically, and then we'll kind of broaden it out and talk about what the slave trade is and why Fort Negley was such an excellent candidate for it. So many of the speakers you'll hear today, as well as Bridget Jones, who you've just heard, can better tell you what slavery looked like in the U.S., and particularly in Nashville and the surrounding areas. So I want to give you the rundown of Fort Negley specifically and how it fits into a larger Atlantic picture. So during the Civil War, the Union military came down here and raided all the local plantations for labor to build the fort. They eventually collected 2,700 people, possibly a little more, and between 600 and 800 of them died during the construction from disease. While this occurred, they were also joined by free blacks from all across the region and runaways looking to get behind Union lines and evade slave catchers. Frances Batson was formerly enslaved. She was one of the people who spoke to the Federal Writers Project when they asked her about this raiding. And she said, quote, "The Union Army's constant raiding and impressment frightened the young black children so much they ran away when they saw the blue man coming." The blue man, of course, being the Union uniform. Dr. Morton, who's the chief Union engineer of Fort Negley, said that the laborers laid out on the works at night under armed guard without blankets and eating only army rations, which contributed to the extremely high death toll during the construction of this fort. And in the top corner there, you have what we think is the only surviving image of the contraband camp at Fort Negley. So Fort Negley was one in 3 such camps in Nashville, and the reason the word contraband is used is because runaways were considered property, right? Because we had chattel slavery here in America, so enslaved people were considered objects and not people. Because of that, they were considered contraband because they snuck themselves, they stole themselves across Union lines. So we know that approximately 20,000 male contrabands were inducted in the Union Army as the U.S. colored troops, and many of these were from Fort Negley. These included James Harding Sr., who was enslaved at the Belmead Plantation. He ran away to help the Union War effort when he thought that he could have that chance. And he has a very robust descendant population still living here in Nashville. We also have the USCT themselves came then to Fort Negley. Many of them were formerly laborers there, and they fought. So Fort Negley was defended by 8 regiments of the USCT. We had 6 infantry, 1 heavy artillery, 1 light artillery. Now that people are doing research, we know some of their names, like Private Peter Bailey, whose descendant, Mr. Gary Burke, who is sitting up here, is a living history interpreter and narrates the National Sites Walking Tour, which you should have in your bag. Please take a look. It was the Fort Negley Descendants Project team that helped to create the Fort Negley Walking Tour. So the majority of soldiers in the colored regiments were fugitive slaves who fought for a host of complicated reasons, among them personal freedom and the opportunity to live in a nation without slavery. That was from Dr. Levitt's book. In December 17, 1864, the Nashville True Union newspaper wrote, "The hills of Nashville will forever attest to how desperately the despised slave will fight when he strikes for freedom." One former black soldier remarked, "I fought to free my mammy and her children all through Nashville and Franklin and Columbia, Tennessee, and all down through Alabama and Georgia. I'm fighting to get free." So this becomes really important later as Fort Negley becomes a symbol of resistance to enslavement. That's a really huge part of understanding, having this global understanding of slavery and its long-lasting impacts. So then after the Civil War, we know that the KKK began using Fort Negley, which sat in the middle of a black neighborhood and overlooked all of Nashville, as its headquarters. It was an important symbolic victory for bitter white Southerners that the racist terrorist organization occupied the Union Fort. If you go to the Tennessean, Betsy Phillips, one of our local writers, journalists, wrote about Leander Wood. He was a veteran of the USCT. He was at the Battle of Nashville, and he lived right at the bottom of that hill where Fort Negley is sitting. And he had enough of the KKK marching through his neighborhood and going up to the top of that hill. And so he practiced drilling. He got his veteran friends from the Civil War. They practiced drilling. They bought a big keg of gunpowder. And, well, the newspaper says that after that, they didn't have the same problems with the KKK anymore. And that article is still in the Tennessean. You should look it up because there's some great research in there. So we know that St. Cloud Hill, upon which Fort Negley sits, was home to the earliest emancipated black populations of Nashville. Dr. Wyatt at MTSU is doing excavations there now with his class and finding their artifacts. And that's down where the hill meets Bass Street over by the city cemetery. And then after the war, this population goes on to help with the establishment of Fisk University and many of Nashville's black institutions in that neighborhood and in North Nashville, which continue to flourish today. So there's this direct connection between this site, between this sacred site, and so many of the things that black Nashville holds sacred today. So, the slave route. I'm going to shift focus really quickly to UNESCO. So, sites of memory are historic sites, museums, and memory initiatives that activate the power of places of memory to shape the public with a deeper understanding of the past and inspire action and shape a just future. UNESCO's project seeks to break the silence around the historical process of the slave trade and foster dialogue, peace, and reconciliation processes. Since its launch in 1994 in Ouida and Benin, this initiative has been supporting research in disregarded areas. I'm going to say that again because that's important. Disregarded areas. Preserving both written and intangible pieces of heritage, creating appropriate methods of teaching that history. And I mean appropriate methods, not what we have now, appropriate methods. And identifying, preserving, and promoting sites of memory that relate to the slave trade. So the slave route also wants to highlight the global transformations and cultural interactions that have resulted from the history and contribute to a culture of peace by promoting reflection on cultural pluralism and intercultural dialogue. So that's a lot to unpack there. But I'm going to try. So Fort Negley and its legacy then isn't just about slavery, right? It's about resistance to that institution and resilience, and most importantly, recovery from that institution as well. Something that Fort Negley's story does really well, and why I believe that it hasn't been given the attention it deserves until recently, is that it changes the entire national and therefore international narrative about enslavement. Fort Negley's robust history isn't only about enslavement, but about those who resisted their enslavement, the people who ran away from plantations to take up arms against their oppressors, and the resilience of those who persisted during the long and difficult period of Reconstruction. There's a long line of descendants from this space who continue to have robust interactions with it. They tell the story of the comprehensive African American experience, one that contains pain, yes, but also so much more. Survival and triumph and community and spirituality and visions of a better future for their children. These are the themes that come up over and over again in the Fort Negley Descendants Project, the people who know that their ancestors belong to this space. These are the messages they say over and over again. We stand on the shoulders of giants. We want better for our children than we had, just like our ancestors. They wanted better for us, and they got that. They fought for it, and they won that. And this changes the whole narrative, right? Because for so many Americans, enslavement and the history of our nation's descendants of Africa is cordoned off or relegated to maybe a week in the curriculum, or if we're lucky, to Black History Month. And this is evidence of America's denial of the past, the very thing that UNESCO found all slaveholding societies have in common: discarded areas. So then, it's no surprise to me that Fort Negley was endangered in 2017. And it's no coincidence that it took Nashville until 2007 to build the Fort Negley Visitor Center. 2007. Like, Fort Negley was built in the 1860s. But Fort Negley speaks to the shared history that some people would rather bury. Nashville isn't alone, though, and America isn't alone either. Remember that big map I showed of the slave trade? So the whole world is struggling with this issue. America wasn't a nation that had slavery. It was a nation whose very backbone was enslavement. The enslaved built this nation. There is not an institution in America that hasn't been touched by slavery. I dare you to find one, because you won't. It is our identity. It shapes who we, everybody in this room, everybody in this nation, are together. So how we handle that information is going to shape how we move forward, as a nation. I'll repeat that. How we handle that information will shape how we move forward together as a nation. So Fort Negley is a place where the descendants of enslavers and the descendants of the enslaved can face this history separately as well as together. That's why the UN has deemed it intrinsic to the world's understanding of itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that research, Dr. Sutton. Let's give her another round of applause. Also, there's a junk drive here. I'm not sure who, oops, wrong mic. I'm not sure who left this junk drive. We're going to take a slight turn on this journey. Dr. Alicia Mosley, the interim Vice President of Academic Affairs, was scheduled to speak after our break this morning, but she does have prior commitments, and so we're going to allow her to come now and give her remarks. Dr. Mosley.
Wow. Great number of people, great crowd as always. Again, good morning, everyone. I bring you greetings from Dr. Glenda Glover, who couldn't be here, but she sends her best wishes from the conference and considers this event to be part of what I think characterizes a university. Connecting students, faculty, alum, and our external family members promote the conversation around important issues of history, equity, and inclusion. And so it's a pleasure for me to be able to give greetings at this 39th Annual Nashville Conference. And as always, I'm happy to be among you who are all so passionate about the history and culture in this region. And the presentations that we've already heard today have really moved us and connected us in a way that really sends a resounding reason why we need to continue to always have this conference and really have it here, Ms. Nguyen. As a career person in the area of business, I've waited so long since an undergraduate for all the predictions that have been associated with 2020. So the year is finally here, and one of the more important predictions that was noted 30 years ago was a demographic shift in the U.S. population. And so we really have seen some of that. But with all the forecasts associated with 2020, I still can't believe that how much has changed and how much has stayed the same. Conversations we've heard in the past have tremendous applicability right now. And so I would all take this opportunity of personal privilege to say we must remain engaged in the discussion and act in real time. We have to use our civic duty and vote in this and every election. It must be something to this voting right. And as everyone has said, it must be something to this voting right, since there are so many suppressing our rights. I don't always know what will happen when I step to the desk and vote. I lived in Mississippi for over 15 years and have been here 7 years, but I can't imagine what those who fought for this right experienced when they stepped up to the desk. Even death was not out of the range to prevent people to vote. And the courage of those people propels me to the desk. Since I have been here, I have watched firsthand people being told that they are not on the rolls or that they are suddenly at the wrong precinct when they have been voting in one particular precinct for over 20 years. So please, we must remain engaged and encourage everyone we know and don't know to jump right into this process. As Dr. Malanga Karenga said about 25 years ago, you should not participate in your own oppression. And the words today that we have, as I think about it, of course I have my vote pen, so that provokes conversation. I say, are you registered? I got my tablet. We can get you registered in 10 minutes. I've been really thinking about Dr. Martin Luther King's speech, mountaintop speech, and the part that I am so connected to is his quote about, now let me say as I move to my conclusion that we've got to give ourselves to this struggle until the end. Nothing would be more tragic than to stop at this point in Memphis. We've got to see it through. And when we have our march, you need to be there. If it means leaving work, if it means leaving school, be there. Be concerned about your brother. You may not be on strike, but either we go up together or we go down together. Let us develop a kind of dangerous unselfishness. And this year for 2020, we need to have that same dangerous unselfishness and act on our right to vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mosley. And so the journey continues. And oh, what a journey our next presenter has had. She was born on an Army base in Vietnam. She attended Vassar College in Connecticut, and she currently lives in Franklin, Tennessee. Tina Jones became interested in the untold stories of African Americans while living in Franklin. She serves on the board of the African American Heritage Society of Williamson County and directs the Slaves to Soldiers program there. Her presentation this morning is titled Fighting to Be Free, Researching Williamson County's U.S. Colored Troop Veterans. Ms. Jones.
Thank you. Do you have announcements? Good morning. Give me just a second while I get my technology going here. Let's see. Is it up? Okay, great. That's always the hardest part of speaking. It is truly a privilege to be here with you today. I have sat where you have sat for several years, so I'm a little intimidated, but I'm so glad to be here, not just to be speaking in front of you all today, but to be sharing the stories of these men who were enslaved in Williamson County and became sailors and soldiers in the United States Navy and the United States Army during the Civil War. I first, whoops, sorry, I'm going too fast, yes. I first became interested in African American history. It'll be 20 years ago this summer in Williamson County when I moved to Franklin, and I took on a program at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Franklin between parishioners and a group of senior citizens who live in two traditionally African American neighborhoods that sit on either side of our church around where our sanctuary is. And we bring a group of about 50 seniors and a group of 30 parishioners together once a month for a meal and bingo or craft or some kind of activity. And so I've been coordinating that. And I know for many of you, I don't get together with some of my best friends once a month for a meal to sit down. We're all so busy. And so after about 5 years of doing that with these seniors, we developed some real connections, and I started to hear different stories from them than was what was being presented. Bridget talked a lot about Franklin and about Carnton, and the history 15 years ago that all that anybody talked about was, you know, the Battle of Franklin and Todd Carter and the Carnton House and Carter House. And I wasn't hearing their stories. And so we took our project in a little bit of a different direction, and we started digging a little deeper. We've written cookbooks, we've written books of advice, we've written books of their own personal history, and I started helping them with their family genealogy. And those of you out there who are genealogists, I know there's a lot of you, you know that you can't be good at genealogy. You can't be good at researching somebody's history without understanding the time and the place where they lived. So I had to learn a lot about Williamson County's history, and I had to learn a lot about what was happening to African Americans in Williamson County. And one of the things that I learned was that when the Civil War started, more than half of Williamson County's residents were enslaved. There were more than 12,000 people living in bondage in Williamson County. And I knew by then, I learned more about the Civil War, I learned more about the Battle of Nashville, and I knew that there had to be men who served in the United States Colored Troops. And we've already heard a lot about the U.S. Colored Troops, but just for those of you who maybe aren't as familiar, so the United States Colored Troops were segregated regiments of the regular Army. Gary Burke is here. Where did Gary go? Would you stand up for just a second, Gary? I hate to put you on the spot. So this is my friend Gary Burke. Like Angela said, Gary is a living historian, and you can see from Gary's uniform, these were the same uniforms that every man in the United States Army wore, the blue uniforms. So that's what the United States Colored Soldiers would have worn. That's what this gentleman's wearing. The only difference, one of the differences, is that black men could only serve as privates, corporals, and sergeants. Above that, they had white officers. And so I started asking about where Williamson County's United States Colored Troop soldiers were, and previous historians had found that there were only 8 men from Williamson County out of, remember, there were 12,000 enslaved people who had served in the federal forces. They said that there were 5 men who served in the Navy and 3 who'd served in the United States Army's Colored Troops. So I didn't think that could be accurate, and I started looking, and so I'm up to over 300 now. 13 men who served in the Navy and 292 men who served in the U.S. Colored Troops. So where did I find all this? Well, it was kind of hiding in plain sight, and I don't mean to disparage previous researchers. I was very lucky in that I started looking at a time when records were being digitized, they were coming online, and they were being indexed. So the place where I really just started finding them was on Ancestry. Ancestry is about half of the United States Colored Troop records online and indexed, so you can put in a name or you can put in a location or a date, and they'll come up. Family Search and Fold 3 also have them. So if you're looking, that's a good place to look. And I hope this is not in poor taste, but I'm going to be giving a workshop for the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society in a couple weeks. If you're interested in learning more about the process that I go through, feel free to come. It's free to members, so you might as well just go ahead and buy a membership. And it's going to be at the Fort Negley Visitor Center, so you can come visit Fort Negley while you're there. So the way that I was finding them was that these are some pictures of what are called compiled military records for soldiers, for U.S. colored troop soldiers. And you can see on the left, this is Private Charles Claiborne's service record. You can see I've highlighted that he was from Williamson County. It says he was born in Williamson County. I'd say 99% of the men that I have on my list were born there. There's a few that I can say for sure lived there, like after the Civil War. He was just 18 years old when he enlisted in April of 1864, and I don't know if you can read it, but he was killed at the Battle of Nashville in December of 1864. And one of the reasons I say that it is truly one of my life's great privilege in finding these men and telling their stories is because without finding Charles in these military records, I'm sure that his name only appears in writing in somebody's probate records. He's listed as Charles on someone's chattel property list. There's no other listing of Charles Claiborne, and we didn't know about him before. And so I feel like we're pulling his story out and bringing him back to life. Andrew Ewing, whose card here is in the middle, he was the Sergeant Major of the 12th United States Colored Infantry. He was the highest ranking African-American soldier in the 12th Regiment. A regiment fully staffed would be 1,000 men, 10 companies of 100 men. He was a little bit older. He was 30 when he enlisted. And then you can see here on the right highlighted, he wasn't just born in Williamson County, but he spent time in service. He was part of Hood's retreat when U.S. colored troops pushed the Confederate Army of Tennessee out south of Tennessee, and he was sick in a hospital in Franklin. And until I started digging into these records, people in Williamson County just had no idea that black soldiers had any role to play in Williamson County's Civil War history. So it has provided a whole new layer of context, and I feel as though we've really moved the needle on what Franklin understands about its Civil War history. Because as Bridget had said, I mean, for decades, 150 years, Franklin's Civil War narrative has been dominated by our Confederate story. It's been our Civil War monument. It's been the freemen of Tennessee who went to fight. It's been our Confederate cemetery. But now we're able to specifically point to the men from Williamson County who served in the United States Colored Troops, many of whom who came back, lived, and died, and are buried with U.S. Colored Troop headstones right here in Franklin. The U.S. Colored Troops was actively recruiting men in Middle Tennessee and in West Tennessee and down near Chattanooga. This is a flyer on the left-hand side that was used in Middle Tennessee. You can see it doesn't have a lot of writing on it because most African-American men at that time were not literate, but it's very graphic. And on the right, this is a listing in the newspaper from November of 1863 showing that they were actually opening recruiting stations. They were actively going out and recruiting African-American men into the United States Colored Troops. And it was highly effective. Of 200,000 black men who served in the United States Army during the Civil War, you can see this is broken out by state. Tennessee had the third highest numbers. Only Kentucky and Louisiana sent more black men to serve in the United States Army during the Civil War. And I feel like this story, I mean, people like Gary Burke have been telling this story for years and years and years, but I feel like we, particularly in Franklin, this story has been purposefully, systematically suppressed and left out of the stories that we tell. So not only has just finding their individual stories been interesting and useful, but I've been able to analyze them because I have enough numbers now to sort of look at them in the aggregate. And you can see that the majority of them served in the 12th and the 13th United States Colored Infantry. This is a photograph of the 12th guarding a bridge down over the Elk River. We also had large numbers serving in the 17th United States Colored Infantry. Gary's great-great-grandfather served in the 17th. And this is a picture that I recently found of their regimental band. And we think that this picture was probably taken in Nashville. So you are one of the first groups to get to see this photograph in a public setting, so that's pretty exciting. And then you'll see another large group I sort of have clumped them all together, served in artillery units. And Angela mentioned this. This is the 2nd Light Artillery that served, and they were at Fort Negley. They were stationed off of Grady White Pike, and they were also part of the battery at Johnsonville, just west of Nashville on the Tennessee River. So another interesting piece of looking at these records is I was able to look at where they enlisted. Remember, 99% of these men were born in Williamson County. The majority of them were between about 18 and 22 years old. So it wasn't surprising to me to see that they were enlisting right in this area. They were enlisting in Franklin and Nashville and Murfreesboro. But when I looked at the whole map, you can also see that there were men enlisting in New York City, Philadelphia, Cleveland, and Chicago, and I can only assume that those men had managed to find their own freedom, that they had escaped. And now, when the country was asking them to, they enlisted and they served, and primarily those men were sent to the Eastern Theater, and they ended up serving in Virginia and North South Carolina, even down into Florida. And other men, you can see, were enlisting in Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas, and those men probably also in their young lives had been sold or taken to those places to farm cotton or other cash crops. And in some cases, we've been able to document that that is what happened to them. This is another just sort of interesting slide showing their enlistment dates. Those very early ones, that starts January 1st, 1863. The very earliest enlistments are the men in the Navy. As soon as the Emancipation Proclamation said that black men could serve in the Army and the Navy, we have men from Williamson County enlisting as early as January 2nd. So we think they were probably already on gunboats in the Cumberland and the Mississippi River, and they were working, but once they could transition into actual soldiers rather than laborers, they take advantage of that opportunity. That big spike, Angela will find interesting, those are a huge group of men enlisting all on the same day at Fort Negley. They're largely men out of the 12th United States Colored Infantry that we know were all men who went right from Fort Negley into the United States Colored Troops. These records are also a great source of research of information for those of you who are genealogists or just historians, maybe running a museum or a site. I know for genealogists, we're always looking for something called brick wall busters, you know, that you hit that brick wall, you don't know where to go. I can't even tell you how much the pension applications for these men provides. This, on the right-hand side, is a picture of a man named Freeman Crothers or Freeman Thomas's pension card. He served in the 12th United States Colored Infantry. He was the first man that I serendipitously decided I was going to try to piece his story together. I could not have picked a better man to try to tell his story. I feel like it was fate that I did because his story has been an abundance of riches. His application, for example, explains why he changed his name from Freeman Crothers, his slaveholder's name, to Freeman Thomas. I know that's often an issue for those of you who are doing genealogy. These pensions will explain that because somebody has to say, why did you enlist under one name and now you're asking for a pension? How do we know you're the same person? They often also, especially if they're asking for a pension for minor children, will give specific ages and birth dates. And I mean, how wonderful is it to find that in a record? This is Ellen German applying for pension. Her husband, Miles German, was killed at the Battle of Nashville fighting in the 13th United States Colored Infantry. These pension applications also they don't just provide the voices of the soldiers, but like I said, with Ellen's application, they provide the voices of women and children, and sometimes even enslavers, which was interesting to me to find. This is a piece from Daphne Perkins' application. She was a mother of Abraham McGavick, and she described in her pension how she was brought to Williamson County when she was 2 years old, and gives kind of a detail of who her different enslavers were and where she lived. She also goes on to say this. She says, Abraham McGavick was my youngest child. I never had any children born since him. I had 13 children. 3 died and 8 were sold south long before the war and are gone from me entirely. When I go speak in Williamson County, I can't do what Bridget does. I mean, I'm just not made that way. And so it's so wonderful for me when I speak to groups to be able to try to explain to them. It's It's one thing to say children were sold from their mothers, but to be able to give Daphne her voice and let her say, 8 of my children were sold and I don't know where they went is so different. It has so much more impact. Right? I mean, to give her that opportunity to tell her story is incredible. And her son, Abraham, so 8 of her children were sold south. One of her children was Abraham, who went on to be a soldier. He was sold away from her when she was 4 and raised by another woman named Julia. And this is Julia's statement in the pension. She says, "It was some 16 years before the war. My master brought a little 4-year-old boy named Abraham. He then became Abraham McGavick. The little boy wearing shirts, like he wasn't even wearing pants yet, was given me to raise. I took care of him until he was about 19 years old when he entered the army. He wrote me letters, and he was raised by me as if my son." So again, we get to hear what Julia's experience was, having to raise a child. She was only 13 years old when she was given Abraham to raise. And this is a statement, like I said, of a woman who was enslaving Andrew Ewing. He was the first sergeant of the 12th United States Colored Infantry. She says, "Andrew Ewing belonged to the estate of my father, Alexander Ewing. Andrew Ewing was my property or under my control until he enlisted in the Federal Army. He was very smart and competent for a Negro." So she seems nice, right? She was actually an ardent Confederate. She is believed to have hung the first Confederate flag in Franklin when Tennessee seceded, and she was the first cousin of Adelicia Ackland of Belmont Mansion, who was the widow of Isaac Franklin, the notorious slave trader. So that just gives you a sense of where her state of mind was. We also have statements sometimes from the children themselves. This is Jarvis Scruggs. His father, Ned Scruggs, served in the 13th United States Colored Infantry. "I was sent by my mother while my father was in the Army at Nashville to take him 6 chickens, and I took them to him. I was shocked at that. I was like, really? He would have been about 13 years old, and she sent him up, probably Nashville with chickens. And he did it." I was so glad that Bridget mentioned the Fisk slave narratives because, like I said, Freeman Thomas has just been the gift that keeps on giving. Many of those slave narratives were anonymous. They don't name who the person being interviewed was. That was the case with Freeman Thomas's interview. He was one of the people interviewed, but because of the details contained in his pension application and just doing good old-fashioned genealogical research, I have 100% identified him as being one of those interviewed. I would literally put one of my children up. I'm that sure that this is Freeman Thomas's voice. And so I feel so lucky that using that pension application, we're able to give Freeman his voice back and identify it, and also to give Franklin Freeman's voice, to say this is one of your own, this man, this is his story, and he was one of ours. He said this, he said, "I ran off from my master when I was about 15 years old and joined the Army. I was in the field shucking corn on the Murfreesboro Pike." This is Highway 96 in Franklin. "All at once, I heard a band playing. Everybody in the field broke and ran. Not a man was left on the place. We all went and joined the Army. The captain sent us back to work on a fort they were building." This would have been Fort Granger in Franklin. "When we finished this, I was sent along with the others to work on Fort Negley in Nashville." Then he said this, "I didn't work there, Fort Negley, no more than about 3 weeks before they started to recruiting colored soldiers. I was sent to Tullahoma for training. This was the biggest thing that ever happened in my life. I felt like a man with a uniform on and a gun in my hand." I know, it's amazing. And then he said this. Did you need me? Oh. He said, "I went to see my mistress on my furlough, and she was glad to see me. She said, 'You remember when you were sick and I had to bring you to the house to nurse you?' And I told her, 'Yes, I remember.' And she said, 'And now you are fighting me.' And I said, 'No, I ain't fighting you. I'm fighting to get free.'" So I can't top that. That's I can't top Freeman's words. So I'm going to stop with that. But I just wanted to say, so I write a blog where I'm telling their stories. I'm working on a project to sell brick pavers in Franklin because I feel like all 300 100 of these men deserve a place to have their names memorialized in downtown Franklin. You can feel free to follow me. I use the hashtag Slaves to Soldiers a lot. We have moved the needle on telling the story significantly. Sometimes I forget that. In Franklin, we've installed a historic marker. The Fuller Story Project has been very active in doing that in Franklin. We've installed a marker on the square in Franklin telling the story of the United States Colored Troops, talking about Freeman Thomas, and we're currently raising money to install a statue of a United States Colored Troop soldier. So we've made a lot of progress. But I would encourage all of you who are from Tennessee, particularly the Middle Tennessee area, to look into these sources of records, because not only do they tie into Fort Negley, they tie into a lot of the sites around here, and I appreciate the opportunity to tell their stories, so thank you.
So how's the journey so far? Every good journey deserves a break. It's break time. We will resume at 10:55. Per my orders, for those of you who have presented, if you'll just hang back a little bit, I think they want to do a photo op with maybe Dr. Mosley, Ms. Wynn, and the planning committee. We're just going to take a few pictures. Everyone else will see you at 10:55. We have a few presentations before lunch. And in keeping with the journey, I'd like to introduce Lieutenant Colonel Sharon Presley, who is a retired Air Force officer and a former professor of aerospace studies at Tennessee State University. She currently serves as a leadership trainer and motivational speaker. Our morning presentations have taken us from slavery to Civil War to Fort Negley, and Ms. Presley is going to take us to the Tuskegee Institute. Her presentation is titled Wing Victory, TSU's Tuskegee Airmen. Please welcome Lieutenant Colonel Sharon Presley.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's so good to be back at Tennessee State University. First of all, Dr. Wynn, ma'am, thank you so much for the invitation to come here once again. I was here last year, and if we could please remember for just a moment Lieutenant William McBriar. Today would be his 159th birthday. So yes, we had Lieutenant William McBriar, Tennessee State University's Medal of Honor recipient, Buffalo Soldier, and one of the first African-American commissionees. We spoke about him last year. That discussion ended up leading to the question, who among Tennessee State University were Tuskegee Airmen? This presentation would not be possible without the efforts of Ms. Sharon Hull-Smith from Special Collections. Ma'am, if you would please stand. Mr. Fletcher Moon of the library. If you please stand as well. Mr. Carl Thomas, the son of Tuskegee Airman, Mr. Wade Thomas Sr., who is unable to join us this morning. Mr. Brandon Van Leer, the artist who rendered the portrait of Lieutenant Joseph C. White for the 2018 Veterans Day ceremony. So if you would please stand. And we are especially honored to have with us today Dr. Katie Kennard White, the widow of Lieutenant Joseph C. White. And Lieutenant Joseph C. White, nephew, Mr. Thomas Kennard. When we start talking about our Tuskegee Airmen, TSU's got a very interesting background. How many people think of Tennessee State University as one of the foremost aviation colleges after World War II? We've got a couple here. Yes. TSU was on the cutting edge of bringing African American pilots into the mainstream. Slides are going to fight with me today. There we go. Tuskegee Airmen, first formed in 1941. If you go back in history, in World War I, African Americans were actually barred from serving as military pilots. Eugene Bullard actually went and fought with the Lafayette Escadrille, first African American pilot who was of American heritage, but he was not allowed to fight for his own country. He actually had to fight with the French. His success helped pave the way for the Tuskegee Airmen. And in 1941, the Army Air Corps brought on board, this is shortly before the establishment of the Army Air Forces, established the first program to bring African American pilots into the ranks. It was established at Tuskegee and consisted of pilots, navigators, mechanics, support staff. You'll see in a lot of the press reports it's very difficult to nail down the actual number of Tuskegee Airmen. Documents from that day are tough to understand. Some of them say 966 pilots, 16,000 support personnel. Some say 972 pilots and 16,000 support personnel. Estimates at this time of all of the Tuskegee Airmen, only 14 survive. We're losing our World War II generation very rapidly. Primarily, there were two units that they consisted of, the 332nd Fighter Group and the 477th Bombardment Group. For further information on the Tuskegee Airmen and their heritage, including several personal interviews with Tuskegee Airmen, please see Silver Wings Civil Rights. Tennessee State University's Tuskegee Airmen basically fall into three categories. Those who actually came here to teach at the university, those who became students at Tennessee State University, and those who continued to serve in the ranks as the Air Force ROTC Detachment 790 commanders. Among these, Dr. Rutherford Adkins, you'll see him here. I will confess an unforgivable ignorance. I just learned his name yesterday. This is a story that is still in progress, a story that's still developing. We do not know the name of all of TSU's Tuskegee Airmen. But he was a professor of physics at Tennessee State University after the war and continued to teach students. Mr. Cecil Ryan is probably the best known. Mr. Cecil Ryan is probably the best known of the instructors at Tennessee State University. This is him right here. He actually started out teaching airmen at Tuskegee in Alabama. He was a thorough instructor, very thorough. We'll talk a little more about that. You'll see some things that are very traditional among the military. One is that many veterans don't talk about their past experiences, and that goes generation to generation to generation of veteran. You'll also find out certain things among aviation instructors are consistent, so you'll see that here in just a couple slides. He was the original head of the Department of Aviation and Industrial Technology here at Tennessee State University. He was a mentor to many of his students, teaching them everything from radar to navigation to flight instruction. Several of his students went on to become Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps pilots. Many others became staunch pilots among the civil aviation in the nation, including Pan American, Eastern, and American Airlines. I want you to remember this because in a later slide, we're going to talk the legacy of TSU's Tuskegee Airmen. He wasn't just an instructor of aviation, he was also an instructor of life. He says you can live a long time in this business if you stay within the rules. He was also known for admonishing his students that you can't spend your way out of debt. This was actually him supporting an aviation club. And like I said, like every single aviation instructor I've ever met, kill yourself, but don't scratch the bird. Like I said, his success as an instructor came in his students. When you see how far his students were able to take their lives and what they did with their lives, his legacy lives on, and I'll show you that coming up here in a few. Like I said, after we discovered Lieutenant William McBriar, Tennessee State University's Medal of Honor recipient, the question rapidly became, who among TSU's alumni were Tuskegee Airmen? Ladies and gentlemen, I want to demonstrate something here. For everyone here who served in the military, would you please stand? Whether you're active, guard, or reserve, please stand. These ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. These ladies and gentlemen may or may not have told you they served in the military. And so a lot of times, we don't know who among our neighbors are veterans. And because most of them are so quiet about it and won't talk about it or can't discuss it, we may not know. One of our tight-lipped veterans was Lieutenant Joseph C. White, class of 1954. Dr. Katie White, who is with us here today, like I said, Bam, thank you so much. She has donated boxes of memorabilia to Tennessee State University's special collection. That is where these photos come from her personal collection. Thank you again, Matt, for this. Now, Lieutenant Joseph C. White is a very interesting young man. He was born in 1921 in Town Creek, Alabama, but he lost his parents at a really young age, so he was raised by an aunt in Chattanooga. At that young age, his character was already showing in the most diligent way possible. You'll notice here, he is actually an Eagle Scout in this photo, looking after younger Boy Scouts. He was at the 1937 Jamboree in Washington, D.C., where he met Eleanor Roosevelt. It says that she patted him on the shoulder, and he didn't wash the shirt for a week. That encounter with Eleanor Roosevelt would come back later on as a strong memory. He also was a huge aviation fan, getting into model aircraft. You can tell he won multiple times. Now, what is tough to see here, you can't see on the screen, is the description. A lot of these competitions were segregated. He had to compete in his own category. The language used was not kind. This young man didn't know the word quit, had no idea what that meant. He knew he loved aviation, he knew he loved model aircraft, he knew he wanted to serve. And that's what he did, consistently. Included in the memorabilia was a letter in Chattanooga that actually stated that he was welcome to participate in the aviation competition. The fact that that letter had to be sent speaks of the time and the challenges that he faced. But like I said, he didn't know the meaning of the word quit. His Aunt Maggie made sure that he never knew that meaning. He enlisted in 1943 with the Tuskegee Airmen and trained with the 332nd Fighter Group. He flew 9 months in the hostile European theater. P-47s, P-51s among the Red Tails. He was based out of Romitelli Airfield in Italy, flying in North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany. Now here's a bit of a question. I love this photo. Actually, this whole set of photos. This is actually taken at Tuskegee Airfield, Morton Field down in Tuskegee, Alabama. What do you notice about what they were wearing? Fleece-lined jackets, thick pants, heavy boots, helmets, leather helmets. Why would anybody dress like this in the middle of Alabama? And the reason is right here. This is an open-air cockpit that they are training in. They're up at altitude. It is freezing cold up there. If you've ever been in a slipstream, standing in the door, getting ready to jump, you pull a parachute, that is ice cold. But they did it. They did it in spite of all the challenges. When asked in an interview what he was proudest of, he said not losing a single Allied bomber to enemy fighters on his watch. Here's the other thing. His life didn't stop being a Tuskegee Airman. He's credited with 1.5 kills in aerial combat. What a lot of us struggle with today, even myself as a military member, we don't understand what was, determined back in 2007, the arsenal of victory. Actually, sorry, 2005, the arsenal of victory. One of the aerial engagements that the Tuskegee Airmen took part in had 300 German fighters. Imagine a sky full of nothing but aircraft attempting to shoot down other aircraft. Bullets flying, multiple gunners, the chaos, shrapnel. He went into that head first. When asked what he was there to do, he said, "I came to fight." He was darn good at it. You'll see him from his initial flight training, being an observer. This is him here. The fighter pilots of World War II, and Lieutenant Joseph C. White as an instructor pilot. But after the war, it didn't stop. Like I said, this young man did not know the word quit. 1954, Bachelor of Science from Tennessee A&I State in physics. Double master's degree, science and education, and a master's in administration. Walton College, University of Tennessee, a PhD in physics from the University of Minnesota. He was a flight radar and electronics instructor in the military at Keesler Air Force Base. He went on to teach at Howard High School in Chattanooga, and then he established the electronics program at Pearl High School. He actually did appear at some speaking engagements discussing his role in the Tuskegee Airmen and his accomplishments in World War II. How many ladies and gentlemen did he pass the legacy of being a Tuskegee Airman? The love for science, technology, engineering, math, aviation. The chance to stand up and demonstrate courage and bravery, to take on a tough mission and succeed in spite of adversity. This proclamation was actually made in Franklin back in 2005, honoring his accomplishments. In 1963, he met Dr. Katie White, back then a student. They had 3 sons. Actually, correct me if I'm wrong on that. 3. 3 children, sorry. 3 children. She was a professor of chemistry here at Tennessee State University. Biology, I apologize. Professor of biology here at Tennessee State University, and correct me if I'm wrong, ma'am, she was one of your instructors? She was one of Ms. Sharon Hill-Smith's instructors as well. Unfortunately, at the age of 86, we lost Lieutenant Joseph C. White in 2007. He was inducted into the Tennessee Hall of Fame later in 2007 for his accomplishments in World War II as one of the Tuskegee Airmen. Mr. Wade Thomas Sr., another of TSU's Tuskegee Airmen. Less is known about his record. He was actually part of the 477th, which is a bomber group. In talking with Mr. Carl Thomas, his comment on it, we were trying to figure out if he was a navigator or a gunner. Mr. Thomas's response was, most likely a navigator. He couldn't hit anything. This is one of the few known photos of Mr. Wade Thomas Sr. as a Tuskegee Airman. After the war, he graduated from A&I, 1949, with a business degree, graduated with distinction, and talk about a distinguished post-World War II career. You notice this is the Black Pages of 1991. This is actually Mr. Wade Thomas Sr., featured prominently on the cover. Just like Lieutenant Joseph C. White, he went on to continue his education with postgraduate degrees at Indiana Central University and the University of Tennessee. He served in the civilian capacity with the state of Tennessee, with the U.S. Postal Service, and with the General Services Administration, which he retired from as the building manager of Region 4 in Atlanta. He didn't stop. He served for 30 years as a real estate broker. His list of civic organizations that he supported and worked with, I'll give you just a brief summary. National Association of Public Accountants, North Carolina Housing Commission, Asheville Board of Adjustments, Asheville Civil Service Board, the Daniel Boone Boy Scout Council, the Vice President of Asheville's Board of Realtors, Asheville's Buncombe Human Relations Council. He was the treasurer of the YMI Cultural Center. He's also a member of the Optimist Club. He was married to Mary Catherine Scuggs, had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He died February 6 in 2000. This actually This was the Veterans Day celebration at which several of his descendants were able to attend back in 2018. He's actually buried in the cemetery here in Nashville. One of the difficulties of studying Tennessee State University's Tuskegee Airmen is sometimes the documentation and the items that reveal themselves are very small. This is TSU's unknown Tuskegee Airman. I don't know his name. This is the only thing that gives me any idea. This is from Ageni, 1942. The school's yearbook from 1942. This tells me he has to be a Tuskegee Airman because a closer view of his hat shows the airman's prop and wings. If anybody has any idea who this gentleman is, we've been trying to find his name for 2 years, and I've failed so far. But this is a work in progress, so if anybody knows who this man is, please let me know. Among the Tuskegee Airmen that we knew most about was the actual original commanders of Air Force ROTC Detachment 790. Air Force ROTC Detachment 790 of the United States Air Force came into existence in 1947, and the first graduating class of airmen from Tennessee State University graduated in 1951. The original commander was Major Dudley M. Watson. You can see him. He's actually in the top row of his class. This is him right here. Major Watson took 790 out of its starting chocks. Unfortunately, he suffered an early death in 1958. Suspicion was due to cancer. But he laid the foundation at Tennessee State University for its future generation of airmen. Colonel Howard L. Baugh. I love this story. born in January of 1920 in Petersburg, Virginia, and was a graduate of Virginia State College. He joined the Tuskegee Airmen in 1942. Now, quick fact about the first 3 commanders of Detachment 790, all 3 of them received the Distinguished Flying Cross in combat. Lieutenant Ball was stationed with 99th Fighter Squadron in Sicily. He had 135 combat missions, flying the P-40. How many did I do? Let's wrap up. Okay. I'll give you 2 minutes. Okay, quick variant of this. Basically, he flew 15 different types of aircraft, 6,000 hours. He taught as an instructor of aerospace studies at Detachment 790. Does anybody recognize this picture here? That is a very young Captain Sharon Presley meeting her hero back at Squadron Officer School in 2000. This is Colonel Howard Ball. Yes, I had the opportunity to meet the gentleman whose footsteps I would be so honored to follow in all these years later. Lieutenant Baugh went on. He worked after he retired. He served a full career in the Air Force. He went on to work at Eastman Kodak in New York. He lost his wife of 54 years, Constance Laney, but before he did, he also has 3 sons that survive him. A sculpture was unveiled at the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia, and he's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. The last instructor that we'll talk about from Tennessee State University, the last of the Tuskegee Airmen among 790's instructors, was Colonel Hannibal Killer Cox, one of 2 African-American pilots to serve in 3 wars, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. According to his daughter, Michelle Cox Stinson, he was one man who wanted to change the world. He had a master's degree, PhD, was an educator and an intellectual, went on to serve with Eastern Airlines. He took Detachment 790 through one of the roughest periods in TSU's history. Shortly after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in an act of arson, the detachment was burned to the ground. An interview with a gentleman who actually was at Tennessee State University at the time said it was an internal act of arson. Reportedly, General Chappie James showed up on campus and said, "What are you doing to keep ROTC here?" Colonel Cox's response was to rebuild the detachment and require that his lieutenants receive their commissions at the graduation ceremony, standing tall and with pride. He's buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen lives on today. General Fig Newton, the Air Force's first 4-star general, was one of Colonel Hannibal Cox's students. Captain Carl Gamble, who landed a flaming aircraft in Vietnam and went on to land a hijacked aircraft in Cuba back in 1984. And one of our most current, Cadet Jerry Kivett, who will graduate this spring, the latest in the long blue line that is Tennessee State University's legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen. In 2013, the Tuskegee Airmen received the Congressional Gold Medal, and although the audio may not work on this, this is Colonel Charles McGee, one of the Tuskegee Airmen. That morning, he received a honorary promotion to Brigadier General. Today's slide is actually still showing, I don't know why. This one, okay. That didn't happen. There we go. Now over 100 years old. This is General Charles McGee, Tuskegee Airman, at the State of the Union Address. Standing next to him. Standing next to him is his grandson, who aspires to be an Air Force Airman. He's currently 13 years old and in Phoenix, Arizona. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today in the State of Tennessee State University's Tuskegee Airmen.
Let's give Ms. Presley another round of applause. If only there were more time, but the journey continues. Our next presenter has taken me on many journeys. And today I'm going to be a willing participant again. Linda T. Wynn is the Assistant Director for State Programs with the Tennessee Historical Commission and a member of the faculty at Fisk University, where she teaches history and public administration. She is a co-founder of this conference, an active scholar, and contributor to numerous, and I do mean numerous, publications. She has served as a consultant to the Frisk Museum, the State Museum, and other organizations. She is a member of the Nashville City Cemetery Board, the Nashville Public Television Advisory Board, and was reappointed to the Metropolitan Historical Commission of Nashville. She's also a member of Spruce Street Baptist Church and a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Her presentation today will be Women's Suffrage, a twofold struggle as women and African American women. Please welcome Linda T. Wynn.
Pam just told me I had 15 minutes. I told someone I have 14 pages, and I thought I had 20 minutes. This is a very complicated story to tell when you begin to look at women's suffrage and African American women in that movement. In the summer of 1920, the state of Tennessee captured the attention of the nation as those who favored women gaining the right to vote of the franchise, who were the suffragists, and those women gaining the right, who did not want to gain the right to vote, the anti-suffragists, descended upon the volunteer state to campaign for their respective positions in the Tennessee General Assembly. On May the 21st, 1919, the amendment cleared the U.S. House of Representatives. The Senate vote came up on June the 4th, 1919, and it was 56-25. As you might imagine, most southern states voting no. 35 of the 36 states needed had ratified the amendment. 8 states had rejected the amendment. 3 refused to act, which left undecided states of North Carolina and Tennessee to make the 19th Amendment a reality for those women across the country. Most southern states rejected women's suffrage amendment because of racialist calculation that the entitlement would also include African American women. Anti-suffragists used this same reasoning in Tennessee. Notwithstanding, suffragists considered Tennessee as their last and best chance for ratification of the presidential election of 1920. If Tennessee ratified the amendment, 27 million women across the country would be eligible to vote in the next presidential election, giving women political power over 130 years after the founding of America. Governor H. Roberts called a special session of the General Assembly on August the 9th, 1920, to consider the issue of women and the vote. Pro-suffragists and anti-suffrage supporters from across the state and the country descended upon Nashville, determined to influence and bring the state legislature to their respective positions. However, the road to the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution began long before the ratification. Women's rights emerged as an issue during the American Revolution. Abigail Adams warned her husband John not to adopt the repressive code of common law, or the ladies were bound to ferment a rebellion. Still, women lost general legal ground with the formation of the United States after the American Revolution. While women had voted under some conditions in the colonies, they lost their right in all state constitutions between 1777 and 1807. Suffragists in the 19th century maintained that they were not asking for a new right, but for the restitution of their foremothers that their foremothers possessed. It was the culmination of almost a century of activism, agitation, and protest for women's suffrage. The right to vote had been an issue at variance with America's founding principles. Since the beginning, when those who penned the lofty document, "We the People," signed on September the 7th, 1887, it basically excluded African Americans apart from the references to enslavement and women. By the 1830s and 40s, the climate began to change when several bold, outspoken women championed diverse social reforms. Activists began to question women's subservience to men and called for a rallying around the abolitionist movement as a way of calling attention to all human rights. From the beginning of African American women faced a double-edged sword. Or as W.B. Du Bois wrote, "One ever feels his two-ness. An American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciling strivings, two warring ideas in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." For African American women, the movement for the right to vote manifested the two-ness as they faced a twofold struggle as women and as African Americans. It's impossible to commemorate the centennial of women's suffrage without looking at the sesquicentennial of the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which gave African American men the vote and its impact on both pro and anti-suffragists. Tennessee abolitionists and women's suffragists first surfaced in the aftermath of the Civil War. The contribution of African American suffragists occurred not only within the women's movement, but also within the larger Black voting rights movement. From the beginning, both men and women were involved in almost a century-long struggle to gain the right of the franchise. Suffragists Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony appropriated control of the 19th century narrative. However, several historians, including Elsa Barkley Brown, Laurie Ginsburg, and Rosalind Turgot Penn, among others, exposed Stanton, the suffragist principal philosopher, as a classic liberal racist who embraced fairness in the abstract while publicly enunciating bigoted views of African American men, whom she characterized as Sambos and incipient rapists after the Civil War. The suffrage took on similar flavor, acquiescing to white supremacy and selling out the interests of African American women when it became expedient to do so. Notwithstanding the racist murmurings of many white suffragists, African American women, both from the state of Tennessee and Nashville, were involved in the struggle for women's rights to access the ballot box. For African American women, women's suffrage was a twofold struggle that intersected both race and gender. Although black women's contribution to the suffrage movement campaign was rarely written about until about 1998, African American women had a more consistent attitude toward the vote than whites. As Rosalind Penn explains in her study, African American Women in the Struggle for the Vote, African Americans maintained a political philosophy of universal suffrage, while whites, including women, advocated a limited, educated suffrage after the Civil War. Black men as a group, especially those in leadership positions, supported and worked for the enfranchisement of women. W.B. Du Bois, who took Frederick Douglass's place as the leading feminist male of his time, recognized the potential advantage of women attaining the right with his succinct observation: votes for women means votes for black women. This view reflected the consensus. Political empowerment of the race required the participation of black women. As Mary Church Terrell, a native Tennessean, stated in her article, The Justice of Women's Suffrage, that appeared in the September 1912 issue of The Crisis, for an intelligent colored man to oppose suffrage is the most preposterous and ridiculous thing in the world. During the 19th century, African Americans and white women organized around the abolitionist movement of the 1830s. Culturally, African Americans in general and African American women faced a public constructed through the forces that were reshaping American society during the 19th century. African Americans confronted notions of racial inferiority that had been developing since the earliest encounters between Americans and Europeans. Excuse me. Bostonian Mariah Stewart, a pioneer African American activist and the first woman to speak before a mixed-gendered audience, spoke out both for the rights of African Americans and women. By addressing the mixed-gendered audience, Stewart shattered the long-standing prescriptions against women speaking about political issues. It is of no small matter that Mariah Stewart was an African American. However, what drew her to the podium were concerns both about womanhood and blackness. For Stewart, the future of African Americans was all bound up with the woman question. She became an early symbol of female activism and reform that became important in the decades after the Civil War. Later, in 1848, in New York's small town of Seneca Falls, at the first Women's Rights Convention in the United States, Elizabeth Cady Stanton waged her discontent by rewording the most famous phrasing in the American political creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. She further proposed a resolution that called for women's right of the franchise. One of the few men and the only African American to attend the Seneca Falls Convention was the Universalist suffragist Frederick Douglass, who supported Stanton and her call giving women the right to vote. He argued that the ballot was the guarantor of all rights, the key to liberty, and women must be bold. Formerly enslaved, Douglass, a woman rights man, knew firsthand the injuries superimposed upon the enslaved and understood that women, like African Americans enslaved and free, were all constrained by American law and custom. Publisher of the North Star, he penned an editorial articulating his unequivocal backing of women's rights. And I quote, "In respect to political rights, we hold women to be justly entitled to all we claim for men. If government only is just, which governs by the free consent of the governed, there can be no reason in the world for denying to women the exercise of the elective franchise or a hand in making and administering laws of the land. 3 years after the Seneca Falls Convention, on May 29, 1851, Sojourner Truth, an abolitionist and formerly enslaved black woman, addressed the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio, despite some white women's effort to prevent her from doing so. Her address has been referred to as "Ain't I a Woman?" However, this speech was written and published in 1863. That's 12 years after Truth gave the "Ain't I a Woman" speech. It was written by a white abolitionist named Frances Gage. She not only changed all of Truth's words, but represented her speaking in a stereotypical Southern black slave accent, rather than Truth's distinctive Upper North Low Dutch accent. The most authentic version of Sojourner Truth's "Ain't I a Woman" speech was published in 1851 by Truth's good friend, the Reverend Robinson, in the Anti-Slavery Bugle, and it was titled "On Women's Rights." Credit for the discovery of Truth's 1851 speech must be given to historian Nell Irvin Painter, a former professor at Princeton University and author of Sojourner Truth, A Life, a Symbol. From the 1850s to 1858, other African American women attended women's rights conventions, including Margaret Forden, Harriet Forden Purvis, and Sarah Parker Redmond, who attended the 1858 National Women's Rights Convention. The American Civil War disrupted the women's suffrage movement, although many continued to champion the abolition of enslavement. Once the war ended and as talk of the 14th and 15th Amendments increased, many women hoped to gain the same right of citizenship that would be granted to those previously enslaved. Prior to the proposed amendments, only white men had the right of the franchise. The 14th Amendment, Section 2, added the first mention of gender into the Constitution, which stipulated that all male citizens over 21 years of age should have access to the ballot. Simply stated, the 14th Amendment defined citizens and voters exclusively as males. The committee that drafted the amendment had inserted the word male, betrayed the feelings of women who had worked for the abolition of enslaved and African American civil rights. Elizabeth Cady Stanton cautioned, if male was inserted into the amendment, it would take almost a century to nullify. Later, Congress passed the 15th Amendment, which granted African American men the right to vote and caused consternation among women who had sought the right of the franchise. After the 15th Amendment's ratification granting voting rights to African American men, Susan B. Anthony declared, "I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ask for the ballot for the Negro and not for the woman." Women's fear came to the realization when the 14th and 15th Amendment combined to grant the vote to African American men, but not women. Many white suffragists, especially in southern states, stressed voting rights for white women to the exclusion of African American women. African American suffragists like Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Mary Burnett Talbot, Mary Church Terrell, and others insisted on full inclusion in the suffrage movement. As America approached the progressive era beginning in 1890, the woman's question again entered the political arena, where it remained until 1920. Before Americans entered the second decade of the 20th century, those women advocating suffrage turned their attention to Washington and the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson, the 28th president and the first Southerner to be elected president since the 1848 election of Zachary Taylor. According to Wilson's biographer, Pulitzer Prize-winning author A. Scott Berg, the president personally favored women's suffrage, but early in his administration held that it was a state matter, states' rights, partly because of strong opposition in the South. This increasingly prominent role took women in an effort in factories and at home convinced Wilson and many others to further the women's suffrage. On March the 13th, the day before Wilson's inauguration, thousands of women marched along Pennsylvania Avenue, the same route that the inaugural parade would take the next day. In a procession by the National American Women's Association, designated to illustrate women's exclusion from the democratic process, the procession was carefully choreographed by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, the newly appointed chairs of the NAWSA's Congressional Committee. The committee was tasked with winning passage of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The amendment reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex." In the 35 years since the amendment was first opposed, it had only come up for a vote in Congress once and failed. The same year that the white women marched along Pennsylvania Avenue, believing that the ability to vote was key to alleviating every aspect of women's inequality, they were joined by African American women. If white women needed the vote to acquire advantages and protections for their rights, noted Adele Hunt Morgan, the leading suffragist of the Tuskegee Women's Club, then black women needed the vote even more. Earlier in the year, Delta Sigma Theta sorority was founded on January 13th by 22 women at Howard University in Washington, D.C. The National Suffrage Association was reluctant to advocate the right to vote for African American women because of racialist attitudes held by some in their ranks. The power of racist congressmen, because of political expediency. Consequently, they were reluctant to include African American women's concerns on their organizational agendas or in their public demonstrations. Before the parade commenced, NAWSA told Ida B. Wells Barnett that she and her Alpha Club would not be allowed to march with whites from Illinois in a prescribed Alpha order. They would have to march at the rear of the line. An irate Wells Barnett refused and left the arena. Instead, she waited along the side of Pennsylvania Avenue until the Illinois group marched by. Then she and two white allies stepped in front of the Illinois delegation and continued in possession. Mary Church Terrell, Delta's first honorary member and author of the official Delta Oath, urged the fledgling sorority to participate in the march, although there was concern about African American women being potential targets of violence. Advocating for women's suffrage was a part of the organization's program, and participation in the march represented an opportunity to put their program into action. Less than 2 months after the founding of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, the founders participated in their first public act, advocating for women to gain the right of the franchise. Later that same year, the women of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated established a second chapter at the University of Chicago, where they played an active role in voting and political concerns of the day. Unlike women activists who often created their own institutions separate from men, African American women often organized within already existing institutions: churches, political organizations, mutual aid societies, and schools. Former Tennesseans Ida B. Wells Barnett and Mary Church Terrell worked assiduously with other African American women, helping to establish such organizations as the National Association of Colored Women, considered by some to be the first civil rights organization. NACW grew to 28 federations with more than 1,000 clubs and membership of 50,000. The first convention of the National Association of Colored Women held its first convention in Nashville in 1897. Nettie Langston Napier, wife of attorney J.C. Napier, served as treasurer of the national organization. Other women included Minnie Lou Crossway, registrar at Fisk University, Doctors Josie E. Wells and Mattie E. Coleman, practicing physicians, Juno Frankie Pierce, and Mrs. Hattie S. Smith Jackson, wife of the Reverend G.L. Jackson. They were founders of women's clubs, and Mrs. Georgia Bradford Boyd, wife of Henry Allen Boyd. These women not only enjoyed local support, but also through such organizations as the NACW and with African American communities in Tuskegee, Atlanta, and Washington, D.C. Perhaps the most notable of these women in the struggle for suffrage is J. Frankie Pierce and Dr. Mattie Coleman. Pierce, a founder of the Nashville Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, also founded and served as president of the Negro Women's Reconstruction League. Like Coleman, she served on the management committee of the Blue Triangle branch of the YWCA. By the end of the second decade of the 20th century, Nashville, the state of Tennessee, and women's suffrage captured center stage. Almost from the beginning, women's suffrage was entangled with the issue of race, and this entanglement played out in Nashville. Despite racism being front and center in Nashville, among both suffragists and anti-suffragists, African American women were among those who favored women having the right to vote. In 1919, as people came to Tennessee for or against becoming the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, the suffrage movement was mostly segregated, especially in the Jim Crow South. Nevertheless, a meeting of white women in Nashville, which Coleman was asked to attend, she offered support for the reforms of white activists and reminded them that 12,000 Negro women of the state are organized and seeking a vocational school for their girls. Pierce and Coleman made the girls' vocational school a part of the program of the Tennessee women's suffrage movement. After the women's clubs worked with white clubs on several social issues, these connections promoted an association in Nashville on women's suffrage. African American women participated in the movement. In May of 1920, Frankie Pierce was asked, "What will the Negro woman do with the vote?" The daughter of a free father and an enslaved mother asked her audience, "We shall stand by white women. We're asking only one thing, a square deal. We want recognition in all forms of government. We want a state vocational school and a child welfare department of the state, and more room in state schools." The League adopted the school as a part of their legislative agenda and lobbied extensively for its passage and realization. Through their actions, African American women echoed Anna Julia Cooper's declaration, "When and where I enter, then and there the whole Negro race enters with me. After the resolution passed the Tennessee State Senate, both suffragists and anti-suffragists desperately lobbied to secure the vote in the House of Representatives. The amendment passed the Tennessee General Assembly on August the 18th, 1920. It was signed into law 2 days later by the United States Secretary of State, Bainbridge Colby, and he issued a proclamation that officially declared the ratification of the 19th Amendment and made it a part of the United States Constitution. Tennessee provided the 36th and final state needed to ratify the amendment that gave women the right to vote. As Frances Ellen Watkins, an abolitionist, suffragist, poet, teacher, public speaker, and writer averred, we are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul. To commemorate Tennessee's role in the ratification of the 19th Amendment, a statue was dedicated in Nashville Centennial Park in 2016. In November of 2019, the Metro Parks and Recreation Department opened the J. Frankie Pierce Park that is located within the state capitol, where Pierce forthrightly put forth a defense for racial and gender equality and told white women what African American women sought from the suffrage was a square deal. Later this year, the Votes for Women's Project will open as a permanent exhibit at the Nashville Public Library. There, visitors will encounter the stories of suffragists and anti-suffragists who converged here in 1920, trying to sway state lawmakers to either defeat or secure women's right to vote in this country. Thank you.
Okay, let's give all our presenters another round of applause, please. I got two quick announcements I want to make. I would encourage you to visit the library to check out some of our artwork. Our librarian, Linda Alvin, has some of her quilts on display, and they are magnificent. I was trying to figure out a good way to convince her to give me one of them. But they are beautiful. And also, we have an exhibit by the artist Laurie Brown. He's an award-winning visual artist, and he's a Jamaica native. His artworks are magnificent as well. And thirdly, right here in this building, after you eat lunch, check out the artwork of Abraham Teklu. He's a visual artist, and his art is on display at the library down in the basement. So once you get a full belly and want to walk it off a little bit, go downstairs and check it out. You will be pleased, I'm sure. Okay. Now I'm going to make an announcement that will probably make you the most favorite presenter today. It's time to eat. Lunch will be served from 12 to, and it says the next performance will begin at 1:30. So eat and try to be back in your seats by 1:25. Okay, thank you. Hang on, hold on there. Oh, I'm sorry. Is Miss Brenda Haywood here from the mayor's office? Okay, hold up on the lunch. We need to hear that.
First of all, I'm only going to take a second. Can you hear me? Hello, hello.
Hello, oh, yeah. I'm going to take a second because I know it's lunchtime and I'm fully aware of what that's indicative of. Yeah. So I need a timekeeper. So can anybody say 3 minutes or less? 3 minutes or less, okay. I see you right there in the red. 3 minutes. Are you a Delta? No, okay, 3 minutes or less. First of all, I want you to know that my name is Brenda Haywood and I am the Deputy Mayor. I want you to know that I just take this anniversary and this time of the year and every day of the year as being Black and Brown and Yellow History Day because we have so much rich history. I want to bring you greetings from the mayor's office. He told me to tell you that he really is regretful that he could not be here today. He has several other engagements, and oftentimes when there are events like this, I'm really glad that he has prior engagements because I get to come and stand before you. I want you to know that on yesterday, I was the African American history speaker, and it meant so much to and for me at Hugh Falk High School. The African American kids, they invited me to speak, and it was so meaningful. They showed videos, and all they wanted to talk about was the African American history right here in Nashville. And I just want to share a little story with you, and then I will be out of your way. Just a really brief story. I was born in 1951, and so in 1960, I saw Diane Nash, and I saw all the kids that acclimated from TSU and FIS and American Baptist and Vanderbilt. They all got together and they marched from FIS to the courthouse. And they asked then Mayor Ben West, do you think that the downtown institutions, stores, Walgreens and McClellan's and Kane Sloan's and Harvey's, they asked him, do you think that's right for us to go in there and spend our money but we can't sit at the counters? And his answer was kind of unequivocal. You know, he told him, well, I have to, he said, no, he said unequivocally, it's not right. But then he told him he'd have to go down and talk to those proprietors and see what they thought about kids sitting and people of color sitting there at the counters. Now keep in mind, and I'm watching all this because I was born in 51, all of this happened in April 19th of 1960. And so I'm a little girl and I'm watching, and I asked my mom and daddy, this just doesn't make sense in my head. And I wanted to be one of those marchers. And they told me, my mom and dad said, girl, sit down. You're just too young to go down there and march. Well, subsequently, I went to Inglewood Elementary School as a 5th grader, and then as a 6th grader. Then I integrated at Stratford High School because the kids told me that you all are ignorant and you're dumb and you can't learn. And the stereotypical jargon and the language that they said was, I could not embrace that. So I went home and I said, Daddy, my best friend Mary, which was Caucasian, her daddy told her that I couldn't go to Stratford. We've been best friends and I still just don't understand all this. He said, you can go anywhere you want to go. But to make a long story extremely short, I went to Stratford and it was 4 of us that went that year. But Stratford started at 7. I got there at 5 and I rehearsed my dad to just go. And I was the first one to ever walk through the doors at Stratford High School as barely a 12-year-old. In 1963, it was 7th through 12th grade. Oh, that's sweet. That almost makes me cry. Thank you for that. But that was just my little contribution. And I told the kids yesterday, whatever pains you the most, that becomes your purpose. So you use your courage or whatever it is God's given you, your athletic ability or your whatever art, whatever gifts and talents you have, you use that outside of yourself to make this world a better place for everybody. Because if we do things introspectively, then we think we're living, but we're not living at all. But this is the way God works. And pardon me if you don't believe, I just want to say this. In 1960, Diane Nash. And I want to tell you something else. Be a great role model because it's hard to become what you can't see. Diane Nash stood out in my mind because she was a young African-American female. I was a younger African-American female. That was James Lawson and all of those. But Diane Nash stood out in my mind. And I said, I can become that. I can be that person that can change the society in some way. So, Diane Nash marched from Fisk to the courthouse to ask Ben West the question that she asked him, and he gave that answer. Well, then, today, Mayor Cooper is our mayor, and he asked me, Brenda Haywood, to be the deputy mayor. So I want you to know that the pendulum has not swung as far as it can, and the dream has not come to fruition, but I think we are moving the needle. And I want to thank you all for allowing me to take a little over 3 minutes. Thank you. Have a
few remarks. The department chair of history at Tennessee State University, I saw him earlier, but I don't see him now. So I want to make sure that all of you are aware that on April the 8th and 9th on this campus, there is an African conference. It's a 2-day conference, very similar to this conference. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see it on the TSU Exchange. I'm thinking that it's already there, but you're all welcome to attend that conference as well. If you have any inquiries, Dr. Lee Williams can answer those questions for you. Also, I feel a little sad today because Gloria McKissick is not here, and this is usually the time of day that she gives presentations or introduces our speakers. But I just wanted to acknowledge Gloria and hope that she feels better. Also, I want to acknowledge the matriarch of this conference, Mrs. Thompson. You could just stand. Okay, our next presenter is the curator at the Frisk Museum, Katie DeMay. Katie has been working on bringing the murals of North Nashville to the Frisk Center, and they are there, I'm thinking. She's also worked on We Shall Overcome, Civil Rights and the Nashville Press, 1957 to 1968. Can we give a warm, Mo Better welcome to Katie DeMay?
Okay, well, that's a tough act to follow, but I will do my best to try to keep everyone awake after that delicious lunch. First, I just want to say what an honor it is to be here, and I want to thank Professor Linda Wynn for inviting me to speak here today. My name is Katie DeMay, and as mentioned, I have been a curator at the Frisk Art Museum since we opened in the spring of 2001. During that time, I've had the good fortune to work on major exhibitions that have received national and international attention, clicking off the official New York Art World boxes and issues present right here in Nashville. That exhibition is Murals of North Nashville Now, and it was on view at the Frist. I'm sorry to say it's closed, but it was on view from last August through early January of this year. And it sought to shine a light on a culturally rich yet often underserved community through the presentation of 8 new site-specific murals made by young artists who lived, worked, or studied in North Nashville. Let's see. Oh, everybody else has been able to figure this out. How can I not? Okay, here we go. So the exhibition was in our always free Conte Community Arts Gallery, and it featured the work of the bright, ambitious, and committed artists you see on the screen now. From the front row, beginning on the left, is Xavier Payne, who goes by the name X Payne, Lysander Bryant, Brandon Donahue, Courtney Adair Johnson, and Marlos Avon. And then on the top row are Dojo and Sensei, two members of the North Art Collective that you'll hear more about soon. Elizabeth Israel Mrozik. Alicia Boat, sorry, thank you, yes, of course. Woke 3 and Omari Booker. Not pictured here are Keep 3, another member of North, and Nuveen Barwari. So, there they are too. Okay, so now it may be surprising to hear that the story of this exhibition actually began with this guy, Chicago-based visual artist Nick Cave. In addition to creating wearable sculptures out of a variety of repurposed everyday objects, Cave directs major multidisciplinary public performances utilizing dancers, musicians, spoken word artists, and many other creatives. And rather than bringing his own troupe from Chicago to the various cities that present one of his performances, he tasks the hosting institution with sourcing the talent. The whole point to him is to offer a stage, literally, to underrepresented local artists, and as he says, to introduce the community to itself and to form bridges. So as part of Cave's exhibition at the Frist from November of 2017 through June of 2018, we produced the massive performance Nick Cave Feat Nashville on April 5th at the Schermerhorn Symphony Center. Did anybody here by any chance get to see it? A couple of people? Great. So as the curator of the exhibition, this task of learning more about our community fell primarily to me. And looking for first a venue for the performance and then for the participants took me to several places that I had not been to before, including the Gentry Center at TSU, the Magruder Family Resource Center, Pearl Cone High School, and many others. Now, some of you may recognize the uniform of the marching band that you see in the balcony, and yes, it was the marching band from Pearl Cone. At first, Nick wanted a marching band. That was a really integral part of his vision. And at first, we were disappointed that the aristocrat of bands was not available. But in the end, Pearl Cone was so much more the right fit for this project in terms of offering the students an opportunity to be a part of this first-rate creative endeavor, to get to work with an internationally acclaimed and successful artist, and to see that the arts can indeed be a viable career path. And especially when we learned how all too many of these students had been directly impacted by gun violence, which is something that's really important to Nick as an artist and as a human being, we wanted to bring them into this project. And in the end, we had well over 200 people participating in the performance. This isn't even everybody. And it was described in the media as art church, It really was spiritual for many of us who participated in it and got to see it. And actually, I just want to give a little plug. If you ever have a spare hour or so and want to watch the performance from beginning to end, it is posted on our Facebook page, and I do highly recommend it. So I also found myself in North Nashville during this time, and by this time I mean about 2016, 2017, doing research at the libraries at Fisk and TSU for another project, We Shall Overcome Civil Rights in the Nashville Press, 1957 to 68. We Shall Overcome